Welcome to my tutorial on how to set up a yeast experiment. We're going to start with the first recipe, which requires grapes, cheesecloth, and flour. You're actually going to need some filtered water, so maybe a Brita or something like that works. You want to have unwashed organic grapes, and cheesecloth, which you can find at a grocery store in the baking aisle. So first you want to actually wrap a quarter-pound of grapes in the cheesecloth. You can actually cut this up to use for all three experiments. Then you mix your 1 cup of flour and 1¼ cup of filtered water together in a bowl. So this is going to give food for the yeast. And then for your grapes, you're going to lightly crush them to release the sugars and then place them in the bowl with the flour and water mix so they're totally covered. Then cover it up with a lid or some wrap and set aside in a spot that won't get direct sunlight, which will kill the yeast. Now you want to repeat these steps 2 more times, but changing something about your experiment. So maybe you'll change the amount of flour, water, the amount of grapes, or something else. Remember, you can go back to the experiments we did with the plants on Gizmos for ideas on different ways to alter your experiment. Maybe you want to put one of your bowls of yeast in a warm area, one in a room temperature area, one in a cold area. Maybe you want to use 3 different types of grapes. Just remember to only change one thing at a time and keep everything else the same so you can collect valuable data. Now, another way to grow yeast is to use whole wheat flour, water, and unbleached flour. So you start with whole wheat flour and you mix a 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour and 1/4 cup of warm water, and you put it in a container and you just mix it together. Pretty straightforward. When you're done mixing, you cover it loosely and you just go ahead and set aside. And ideally, it's a place that's not too cold, not too warm. And each day you discard half the mixture. You feed the yeast by adding a 1/2 cup of white flour and a 1/2 cup of warm water, and you mix. Now, pretty straightforward, but you need to repeat these steps 2 more times. This time you can change the different temperature of water, hot, cold, room temperature, 3 different types of flour, or something else. And then for both of my experiments, I set up a data table in my notebook. So I recorded the date, the time, the weather, and then I took observations every single day of both the grape yeast and also the yeast using the whole wheat. So I was looking for bubbles, I was looking for color change, and I was also looking for the smell to change. I recommend taking sketches along the way or taking photos and keeping track of them so that later when you analyze the data, it's a lot easier. So here's a photo from day 3 of my grape mixture. You can see that the yeast is starting to activate. I've actually captured some yeast because there's some bubbles and it starts to smell a little bit fruity and there's a liquid on top. So now comparing that to my other recipe, you can see after day 3, similar things. There's not the liquid or fruity smell, but there are definitely bubbles on top. And that's basically the yeast eating the food and producing carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, on day 6, my grape and yeast mixture ended up having some mold on it. And so I think this was because I didn't cover it tightly. I just had a bowl with a rubber band around it. Because I had mold, I had to get rid of it and start over again. If this happens to you, same thing, but that's why I recommend using a jar or a bowl with a lid that covers tightly. Now for the whole wheat yeast experiment, on day 8, I can see there's a lot of bubbles and there start to be little rivets in the mixture. That tells me it's time, my starter is ready, and I can actually go ahead, feed it one more time, and put it in the refrigerator and to prepare for baking with it. Now my last step of the experiment is I'm going to use my 3 different yeast experiments, whatever they are. Maybe you changed the temperature of water, you changed the amount of flour, type of flour. And then I'm going to use those 3 experiments to bake 3 different sourdough breads using the exact same recipe. And then I'm going to collect data based on how those different yeast performed, so the fluffiness and how much it rose and the overall flavor of the bread. So make sure that you go and look at the recipes for the different types of yeast experiments. You can look at the grape sourdough starter. It tells you all the directions I recommend cutting all the ingredients at least by half because you're going to be making 3 versions of this and you don't want to waste a bunch of flour. There's also the other recipe I used is from King Arthur flour. This is the one that starts with whole wheat. It has great tips on how to do it. Again, cut the recipe in half to start so that you don't end up wasting a bunch of flour. Now go design your experiment. You've got this.